Covert DNA collection, human genetic modification, biohacking, gene editing, bio-weaponary. It's all going on around us every day, but most of us know nothing about this shadowy world of genetics. From myself, Mark L. Watson, this is Double Helix. In 1997, a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit came up with an inventive new business plan. He graduated just a couple of years prior with a master's in molecular medicine and genetics, and his name was Terence Carmichael. His company was called GeneTree. It allowed users to create an account and upload the results of DNA tests, which could also be ordered through the website. With the results, users could access a rather limited database and create their own little family tree. Much of its early business was in paternity testing, allowing its customers the access to the technology needed to determine if their Y chromosome matched another set of DNA data, thus establishing a genetic link on the male side of their lineage. To explain briefly here, and I'm keen that this podcast doesn't become too scientific, but there is a little you will need to know before we can go much further, and you'll certainly need to understand a bit of this as we delve further down the rabbit hole in the rest of the show. But I promise to keep it simple and keep it brief. Most humans are born with 23 pairs of chromosomes, making 46 in total. If you don't have 46, you tend to have been born with some form of disability, which can of course manifest in countless ways and affect people to varying degrees. Those chromosomes are made of protein and contain a single molecule of DNA, those little vital instructions on how to make you. Each chromosome keeps everything neatly packed inside. There's enough DNA strands in each human cell to stretch out over 6 feet if they're laid out end to end, so it's practically inconceivable how it can wind up inside something so tiny. Every human, indeed most mammals, have 2 sex chromosomes or gender chromosomes. They form the basis of what is called the XY sex determination system. It's what determines, as the name suggests, the gender of an animal or a human. Loads of different mammals, some snakes, fish, even some plants. Females have 2 of the X chromosomes, so would be classed as XX, and males would have XY. The Y chromosome is only passed from father to son, so it's only present in males. Everyone needs 1 X chromosome to live. Now, there are a few tiny exceptions to this. There are various situations where the XY are not present in the way I've just described, but these are incredibly rare. Anyway, science lesson over for now. There will be more, so don't throw away your textbooks quite yet. So paternity testing is relatively straightforward, as if 2 people share the same Y DNA, then there is a hereditary link shown on the father's side. On the other side of the page is the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from a mother to either of her children, whatever the gender. It's through this that maternity testing can be done. And that is where GeneTree started its business. A few years later, with limited output, its assets were sold, and a later buyout of the entire group of businesses became what is now known as Ancestry.com. It was a few years after that, in 2007, that 23andMe.com became the very first to offer direct-to-consumer genetic testing using saliva as the source data. They're the ones we're familiar with now, the ones where the consumer and the company deal directly with one another, hence the name. 23andMe also became the first to use data from an autosomal chromosome. Now, these are basically the numbered pairs, 23 in each person, as 23andMe indicates, with one pair being the X and Y chromosomes, and so the autosomal chromosomes are essentially the other 22 pairs. They are, as we've mentioned, the building blocks of you, and each contains anywhere from 750 to up to 3,000 genes, depending on which chromosome you look at. Again, examining the autosomal DNA for ancestry determination is now something that all the other direct-to-consumer sites now use. The processing capabilities grew from here. The accuracy of the results grew. The audience grew, and the market is now crowded with huge billion-dollar companies offering a range of genetic testing straight to your door. Order the kit, spit in the jar, send it back. These genealogy testing kits can now, with varying though largely impressive degrees of accuracy, tell you where your ancestry is from, details of your ethnicity, and about hundreds of inheritable diseases. Results, I will go on record here as stating, which should be taken with a pinch of salt. They don't claim to be faultless, and they're not. As fun as it may be to figure out what percentage of your history is from Western Africa or Eastern America, to wonder and to wow at the fact that despite your blonde hair, you're apparently 4% Vietnamese or 11% Angolan. If you're trying to determine anything serious about your own health, then please consult a doctor instead of a DIY mail-order kit. The genetic testing market surpassed the $14.8 billion mark in 2020, with forecasts projecting that will have doubled to nearly $30 billion by 2027. Global Market Insights reported last year that according to the data published by the World Health Organization, quote, rising prevalence of inherited diseases including sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis and haemophilia will fuel the genetic testing market demand. So, the amount of people around the world, and these companies are providing services across every continent, has grown and will grow further to include millions and millions of us. And so the big question is presented. Where does the genetic data, your DNA, your genomes, where does it go once they've finished telling you where your ancestors are from? Well, it just gets securely disposed of, right? Incinerated, protected from further use, or to stop it falling into the hands of other companies who may use it for their own research. Yeah? No. Absolutely not. Companies like 23andMe.com and Ancestry.com sell your data, albeit anonymously, to many other companies and research facilities. They remove your name and details from the genetic sample, and they sell it on its own merit as a piece of data, a sample of some member of the population. Firms like Procter & Gamble, GlaxoSmithKline and Pepto-Bismol have huge multi-million-dollar contracts to purchase your DNA data from these genealogy sites, as do a number of universities, especially in the USA. They use it to research and to develop new pharmaceuticals, new medicines, new drugs, and also to help determine what sort of person, what sort of medical data set should be sampled for future drugs trials. They're reasonably open about this, though it's clearly not painted loudly on their packaging and their brief. Though, if you read the small print when you sign up to one of these genealogy tests, they do give you a small option to opt in or out of the aforementioned passing on of your data. Your personal data stays with them unless they receive a court order from law enforcement. Genetic data in a database like this can help solve important criminal cases, and I personally agree that it should. It was only a few years back, 2018, that police in California were able to use online DNA databases to whittle their way through the family tree and triangulate the identity of the Golden State Killer as one Joseph James DeAngelo, guilty of countless murders and rapes across many years. But beyond the authorities filing for the release of your data for crime-fighting purposes, is it really safe? Your data is protected under the existing privacy policies of whoever you sent your DNA to, but they all reserve the right to change these as they see fit and without any detailed notice. And it should of course be remembered, few people ever actually read privacy policies in the first place. Apparently under 10% do so, according to a study by the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. And what's more, the existing privacy policies for many of the companies involved are far from clear or forthcoming. And indeed, according to James Hazel, a research fellow at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, 39% of the 90 DNA testing companies researched had, quote, no readily accessible policy applicable to genetic data on their website at all. Most of the big companies have signed up to a best practices policy framework, agreeing to take strong security measures and to guarantee transparency around their data collection. But none of it is legally mandated at all, and so failure to meet the policy wouldn't amount to any legal ramifications whatsoever. James Hazel goes on to explain that while many of the big companies suffer in some respects from being large and in the public eye, unable to slip up and place themselves in a PR nightmare, many of the smaller companies survive under the radar and can operate with a lot more freedom. So what would anyone want with your data? Why would anyone care about your DNA, your genetic makeup, your coding? Even with your name and address, so what? Well, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act in the USA and part of the Equalities Act in the UK, amongst many others worldwide, prevent healthcare companies and employers from using genetic data to deny you employment or insurance coverage. Actually, the Equalities Act doesn't actually formally prohibit the insurance side of it. The intention of these pieces of legislation is to prevent potential employers and insurance companies from denying coverage or discriminating against people based on, for example, the presence of a cancer-related genetic variant present in your DNA sample. It's a safeguard against unfair treatment, especially when errors can be made in your sample and in your data. Though it's important to note, companies with fewer than 15 people are exempt from this rule, as are life insurance, disability insurance, and long-term care insurance companies in the USA, all of which are legally permitted to request genetic testing as part of their application process. And once these companies, or even the big pharmaceutical companies who have bought your data over the table, have it, what they do with it is up to them. Where it goes is down to whatever is decided at those research labs, in those boardrooms. It's no longer your DNA. It's no longer the responsibility of the genealogy testing company either. So, how safe is it? Well, that is very difficult to answer. The privacy policies, when you can find them, will tell you that it's very safe. The legislation will tell you it's safe. But data hacks are extremely common. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, state-sponsored attacks from the likes of the Chinese are very common and often on a grand scale. And the dangerous thing about a data hack of your genetic thumbprint is that it can never be changed. You can change your personal details, your bank account, cancel your cards, block your accounts. You can even change your name. But your genetic code is yours forever, and it's only yours. And it's not just through these methods of hacking into Western data that puts your genetic data into the hands of the Chinese. And once again, all roads lead back to BGI. BGI, as I've said previously, are the Beijing Genomics Institute, and now the BGI group of companies and subsidiaries. They're the largest genomics company in China, one of the largest in the world, and whilst they're officially a private-run enterprise, they frequently act as the genetics and genomics arm of the ruling Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. BGI manufactures and distributes their own prenatal test under the brand name Nifty. It's a highly effective way for pregnant women to screen themselves before giving birth, to check for over 80 different pre-existing genetic conditions from as early as 10 weeks into the pregnancy, and it claims to be over 99% effective at detecting the 3 most common conditions at birth, namely Down syndrome, Edwards syndrome, and Patau syndrome. It's what's referred to as a non-invasive prenatal test, as it poses no risk to either mother or baby. The Nifty test is available in 52 different countries around the world and through over 2,000 clinical partners, as proudly boasted on their website, and they can turn the results around in only 10 working days. It's one of the most popular tests of its type globally and claims to have carried out almost 10 million tests on pregnant women and their unborn children. But if you've heard a word of this podcast thus far, then you'll be able to predict with some slight informed level of accuracy what comes next in this story. Because as usual, all is not what it seems. The Nifty website does include a privacy policy, and on inspection it explains the following: that any customer's personal information can, and of course therefore will, be collected and processed by BGI, whatever the latter part of that statement actually means. It states that personal data, as referenced in the above, can include name, address, contact details, height, weight, gender, nationality, date of birth, but then also your employment details, including your job title and employer information, banking information, family history, medical history, including any conditions for which medical advice or treatment was sought, any form of consultation, investigation, prescription, any allergies, your lifestyle habits, and a record of any current medication that you may be on. All that is actually needed to determine whether or not a sample blood test contains the genetic markers which identify the likes of Down syndrome and Edwards syndrome is the blood sample. So what the hell do they want with all that other information? Well, it's to piece together a fuller picture of you, their new piece of data. They now have all your personal, physical, employment, banking, family details, a copy of your DNA, and all manner of private medical information, the likes of which you would not readily share even with your close friends. But who reads the privacy policy though, eh? Your information is used to, quote, perform and improve our services, as Nifty says, and to update you and contact you about their services. Though it also goes on to state that, quote, BGI may also share your personal information collected with its affiliate companies, trusted third parties, whatever that means, suppliers and subcontractors. It's all starting to get a little murky, isn't it? A Reuters Investigates article from July 2021 starts to shed a little more light onto the darkening rooms of BGI and Nifty. Its authors, Kirsty Needham and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Claire Baldwin, report that one BGI study that they looked into, quote, used a military supercomputer to reanalyze Nifty data and map the prevalence of viruses in Chinese women, looking for any indicators of mental illness in them, and thus allowing them to, quote, single out Tibetan and Uyghur minorities to find links between their genes and their characteristics. And so you see, my story here comes full circle back to where I started just a few episodes ago. Such collaboration with the military is not new. Indeed, it really underpins much of the genetic surveillance the Chinese government carries out, and certainly a great deal of the physical collection of DNA data the forced submission of blood samples, etc. It falls to the military, at least to law enforcement, to carry out. But the military and prenatal testing isn't something that one would think would walk hand in hand. The Reuters review reported on at least a dozen tests which had been carried out between BGI and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, in just the last 10 years. And, crucially, the data harnessed from the nifty tests, along with the plethora of other data collection methods employed by BGI, includes the genetic and personal data of civilians, subjects, victims, if you will, from outside of China. That would be those other 51 countries that the test's available in then. The nifty website states that the data collected from its tests and from its customers, whether personal, medical, genetic or otherwise, can, and as I said, thus will, be shared when it's deemed a matter of national security. And even though most of us would and could never pose a national security risk to the Chinese state, genetic data is seen as a security concern to the CCP, and by extension, BGI.
I mean, again, this is where sort of the foundational ideas about necessity, legitimacy, and proportionality come in, and all of the surrounding protections one needs to take those abstract concepts and make them a reality. To be able to say to a police force, why do you need this particular data, as opposed to, a fingerprint, a home address, some other piece, a national ID number, right? Some other piece of identifying information.
That's Sophie Richardson, the China director of Human Rights Watch. We've heard a little from her in previous episodes and will likely be hearing from her again. She's an absolute authority on the subject and has spent many years studying what's going on in China, in the Xinjiang region, and is really the point of all knowledge when it comes to the human rights and civil rights breaches that are currently being taken by the CCP within China.
Is it reasonable for a government to collect DNA samples, from children or from all people in some incredibly broad category, right? And legitimacy, is there a real compelling need under international law?
Without consent. I mean, that's grounded, kind of an important thing.
Right.
Taking it from children without parental consent. I mean,
right. I mean, the legitimacy test is, is there actually a legitimate legal or other need for that particular kind of data? I mean, those are sort of the broad principles. They're obviously better, although I'd certainly not say perfectly ensured in democracies across China, and particularly across regions like the Uyghur region and Tibet, where people have virtually no ability to say no to official demands or requirements without suffering other reprisals. None of those tests are met. Not a one. It's not necessary, it's not legitimate, it's not proportionate. Sure. And it's not like you can write a letter to the editor complaining or vote for somebody else for a local official. And the bit that we know, or we think we know or understand about the state's intent, really is about deepening knowledge and control of people all the way down to the individual level, but also being able to see what the connections between people are. And this is technology that gives an already incredibly powerful state that much more power when, if anything, the trend needs to be running in the other direction.
It uses such data to mass test and research pathogens and to develop ways of protecting its soldiers from altitude sickness. It's all stored in the giant state-funded gene database facility under the control of the BGI group. Its storage capabilities are vast, beyond the real comprehension of most of us. It's the jewel in the crown of the program to push Chinese genetics to the forefront, to bring them to being leaders in the industry on the world stage. It's all part of the Made in China 2025 campaign, a national strategic plan and policy from the CCP to make China the best of the best, a place it feels it belongs. The facility is something else. Set into the foothills of the Guanyin Mountains in Dapeng New District, a little outside the city of Shenzhen, the fourth most populous city in China. The building is constructed from layer after layer of concrete and glass, somewhat resembling a cruise ship in the way it's stacked up. Sweeping curves aside a great man-made lake, and tucked into the hillside itself, it's a cross between a grand hotel resort and something from Jurassic World. And the interior keeps up that trend. In the vast open lobby of the reception stands a huge woolly mammoth, 15 feet or more tall. This one is made of plastic and fiberglass, but it stands as a representation of the bigger picture. One of the main goals is to be the first to bring the great old beast back from the dead. It does share 99.6% of its DNA with the Asian elephant, so there isn't too much ground to make up. Though it must be stated here that humans and chimps share around 99% too, and whilst there are a great many similarities between those two species, most of the time there are a great many differences too. Indeed, humans share around 70% of their DNA with worms, just to put it into perspective. You share around 44% with bananas too, but let's not keep doing this. Geneticists and biologists have been trudging slowly along this path for many years now, and there have been plenty of breakthroughs along the way for doing so. I've been following this venture for some time, and every now and again there's a little glimpse that things have taken a step forward and that such biological marvels may one day be possible. Whether it's ethical, responsible, or quite even necessary is a discussion for another day, but certainly one that should be had. George Church, considered by most to be the founding father of genomics and who we'll speak about in more detail soon, has pursued the revival of the prehistoric mammoth for much of his career. The process of bringing an animal back is a long and extremely complex one, hence its as yet unsuccessful nature. The first thing is to construct the animal's genome, the genetic information used to build any living thing. Those long and multiple strands of DNA which we've been speaking so much about. Mammoths are, on the evolutionary scale of things, fairly recent creatures, and the frozen remains have been found. But once an animal dies, its DNA begins to deteriorate and to break down, meaning that any samples that scientists do have are incomplete. Though by putting together every little piece that they have, and by using its closest living relative as a sort of guide, a blueprint, it's possible to create a genetic map, a layout of the creature. The process started small, trying to create the simplest of cells, those with little productive use, and then move on to the more complex ones, such as the cells found in the organs, the liver, the kidney, the blood. And finally, when the animal was or is mapped, the team can move on to the embryo of the mammoth. And once that's complete, the fetus can be grown in either an artificial womb or even in the womb of an Asian elephant. Though what is born would not be an actual woolly mammoth, it wouldn't be made of 100% woolly mammoth DNA, as parts of it would need to be spliced in from the Asian elephant, and so what we would actually have is a mammoth-elephant hybrid. But it would be as close as we're going to get, and would at least look exactly right from the outside. But beyond playing Dr. John Hammond from Jurassic Park, creating and recreating prehistoric creatures for pleasure and for fame and for fortune, the process actually has a more responsible subplot. It's reasoned that through such endeavours, with the necessary breakthroughs in genetics and various fields of biology, then advances can be made which prove significant enough to be useful in keeping other currently still alive but endangered animals from going extinct. The Genetic Database Facility in Shenzhen, or to give it its other rather catchy proper name, China National Gene Bank Database, or its even more catchy acronym, the CNGBDB, may well employ some of the most controversial research, but it's not the only one of its kind, and it's not even the largest. For that, we're going to have to jump on a plane and head back west. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, was created by the FBI in 1989 and contains various levels of genetic databases depending on what sort of data is being searched against. With significantly less nefarious intentions in mind, the database holds in its keep the DNA records of convicted criminals, missing persons, and a wealth of genetic information which has been obtained from crime scenes. Currently, everyone in the USA who's convicted of a felony, which, for those not familiar with the US legal system, is the higher of the two categories of criminal offence, the other being a misdemeanor, has their DNA taken and kept on record in CODIS. Some states include juveniles in this too, though most do not. Each state, as with much of the running of the USA, has some autonomy over the way it implements and governs such things. Important to note, though, some states have implemented the collection of DNA records for those who've been arrested in connection with a crime, even if they haven't been convicted. Even in the states which don't do this, there are still certain exemptions, such as the state medical examiner, who's able to take DNA after merely an arrest. This has, and still does, cause serious constitutional and civil rights concerns in the USA. And it parallels perfectly a series of legal challenges and amendments to legislation, on my side of the pond too. The UK National DNA Database is also one of the largest in the world, and as of 2020, it held over 6.5 million profiles. The key difference between this and, for example, China's database is that the UK does not hold the entire genome, only certain strings of DNA data. That said, it does hold on file blood samples and other genetic materials such as hair or skin samples, where those samples pertain to a crime or another policing matter. Originally, when the UK database was set up in 1995, the authorities in England and Wales could only take the DNA of convicted criminals. In 2001, so 6 years later, the Criminal Justice and Police Act was amended to allow DNA to be taken from suspects who are still awaiting trial and kept on file even if the suspect was subsequently acquitted and released. A couple of years later, it was amended again to allow the authorities to take a DNA sample when a suspect was arrested and not have to wait for them to be charged, and it went on to mean that anyone involved or even suspected of being involved in any recordable offence, with the exception of some very minor ones, could have their sample taken and kept on file in the DNA database. Scotland operates a little differently with their own sets of regulations and their own branch of the DNA database, as do some of the other Crown dependencies such as the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands. In 2012, the UK DNA database could and did hold on to genetic samples indefinitely. There was no limit to how long they could be kept on file, so they just kept them. But a series of legal challenges, both within the UK and also to the European Court of Human Rights, has clawed some of the freedoms back from the authorities. In 2008, 17 judges at the European Court of Human Rights unanimously ruled that keeping one's samples on file indefinitely was, quote, not necessary in a democratic society. And it was in contravention of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the court said, and that's the part of the framework that rules that a person should be entitled to a private family life. In response, the UK government and the DNA database stated that whilst they retained the right, and indeed the need, to keep the files of anyone suspected of a crime, anyone who'd been released without conviction should have their right to their own life. Those samples can still be kept for anywhere up to 6 years, and personally I don't entirely understand why, if that person was completely innocent of the crime of which they were accused at the time of arrest. Various nations around the world have their own DNA databases, varying a little in terms of size, scope, practicality, and what they can legally do in terms of collection and storage. Aside from the UK and the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Portugal, Sweden, Brazil, Japan, Israel, Dubai, Russia, India, all have variations of the database. And of course, when you dive a little deeper into each of them, they do all have their controversies, and they've all been subject to criticisms, to legal challenges, to accusations of infringements on human rights or civil rights and liberties. But it can be said, more than generally, that all of them have been used with the best intentions in mind. They're policing and medical databases used to track and trace criminals, find missing people, solve cases, and find familial links to wanted suspects or individuals involved in crimes. The Chinese, on the other hand, have been busy at work in their big mountainside facility, playing an altogether different game. The millions and millions of DNA samples which are now kept by the China DNA database have given BGI the ability to run genetic resource tests on an entirely unprecedented level. There has been no way, not until now, for any research facility or indeed any nation to study the genetic profiles of an entire population. But in a 2018 paper published by Cell Press, a peer-reviewed scientific journal, BGI researchers said that they'd recently undertaken the largest ever study on Chinese population genetics. And how did they pull it all off? While using 141,000 nifty prenatal tests. It's an untapped resource, they said. The research has been used for all manner of purposes, to identify genetic traits of various minorities within the Chinese population, to develop drugs and pharmaceuticals, to follow intermarriage trends and to aid the mass genocide against their own people. Much of this is now well documented, and if it wasn't then it is now, even if you heard of it here first. But somewhere in a dark corner laboratory, the one where the eyes of the world's science journals aren't looking, something far more sinister has been underway. And it's something you're more likely to hear about in a Marvel comic. You see, BGI has also been looking at how to change DNA. I'll let that hang for just a second. Recent developments in genetics have brought about the ability to edit, to change, to enhance the DNA of a human. To focus on one tiny trait, one specific DNA purpose or role, and then to edit it. It's called genetic editing, and it appears to be the future. And the ability to genetically edit another human can now be mailed right to your door.
Double Helix was written and produced by myself, Mark Watson. Sound design is produced with credit to Looperman and Pixabay. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the show, and to all my guests who kindly gave up time from their busy schedules to speak with us. And I'd like to thank you too, the listener. Without your support, none of this would be possible. You can find more content and follow my work at marklwatson.co.uk or by searching anywhere online. Thank you for listening, and please go and dig deeper on everything that has been discussed in this show. There is so much more yet to uncover.